Parashat VaYakhel, we read about all the efforts of the Israelite nation to build the Mishkan, the Holy Tabernacle, all the different activities that involves, constructing the different pieces, metalworking and weaving, etc. And that culminates in a statement, ויבואו כל החכמים העושים את כל מלאכת הקודש, איש איש במלאכתו אשר המה עושים. And all the wise men that did all the work of the sanctuary came every man from his work which they made. ויאמרו אל משה לאמור, מרבים העם להביא מידי העבודה למלאכה, אשר ציווה אדוני לעשות אותה. And they spoke to Moshe, saying, the people bring much more than enough for the service of the work which the Lord commanded to make. ויצא משה, ויעבירו כל במחנה לאמור, איש ואישה, אל יעשו עוד מלאכה לתרומת הקודש, ויקלה העם מהביא. And Moses gave the commandment, and they caused it to be proclaimed throughout the camp, saying, let neither man nor woman do any more work for the offering of the sanctuary. So the people were restrained from bringing. והמלאכה הייתה בים לכל המלאכה לעשות אותה ויותר. For the stuff that they had was sufficient for all the work to make it and more. This is an interesting passage, but it's easy to miss because it just sounds like a bit of good news in the midst of a lot of work that everyone's doing, right? We all know that their job is to build the Mishkan, and they want to do that because they're trying to serve Hashem according to his Torah. They just received these mitzvot about how to build the Mishkan, and people are getting to work. And now we see that in terms of all the materials being volunteered and maybe all the work that's being done, that there's an abundance of it, an overabundance of it. They don't need all that's being offered in order to accomplish the mitzvah or the set of mitzvot that have been given to them. And so Moshe tells them to hold back. And it's easy enough, I think, to glide past this and just say, well, it's nice that people had such generosity. And it's making a point about how Bnei Israel had such a desire to volunteer from themselves, to give more than was actually needed for Hashem. But I think you can raise a serious point around this, both in connection with the Mikdash specifically, the temple, and also with respect to the general idea of serving Hashem, avodat Hashem. Because what it raises for us is the possibility that we might not have correct instincts in how much we're trying to offer to Hashem in a certain fashion. At least with regard to the Mikdash, right? That the narrow point here is that the Mikdash is a specific thing with specific properties, and there's no way of saying, well, but I want an even more splendorous one, so I'm going to put in twice as much gold. Right? So part of this is just about saying, no, Hashem has given you the specifications, make it according to the spec, and don't be creative. It sounds like a good thing to be sort of more generous and to want to give more to Hashem, but actually it's a problem because then it becomes your creative license, right? It's no longer being done according to the mitzvah. So partly this is about maybe a point more generally for mitzvot, but certainly a point for the Mikdash, saying that there are certain aspects where we don't necessarily bring our creativity into it, even when we might mean well, and even when it seems naively like we're trying to give more to Hashem, and what could be better than that? And it's actually the case that we can go astray that way. But I think this raises a broader point, again, either about the Mikdash or about Hashem in general, which is, what is the point of life and how much of ourselves are we meant to give to serving Hashem? Because here what we have is people trying to give seemingly everything they have, or at least much of what they have, to this project. And Moshe is saying, whoa, hang on, that's too much. Like, it's possible out of an instinct to give it all to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to overdo it. And we might wonder whether that somehow runs counter to other things we read in the Torah that seem to suggest something more boundless and absolute about, what we're trying to give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, for example, in Kriyat Shema, we say, "Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha." So you should love Hashem, the Lord your God, with all your heart. And really, we'll return to this, with all your hearts, levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, with all of your being, b'chol me'odecha. And another time we could talk about what each of those things maybe means, what is me'odecha as opposed to nafshecha. But rather than dwell on that now, I think, just centering on the first point, b'chol levavcha, you should love Hashem with all your heart. Now, the heart in the language of the Torah is not just some kind of place that romantic feeling sits. It's the seat of the intellect from the standpoint of the Torah and Chazal. It is your whole worldview, everything that you understand and know, which carries forward even into modern Hebrew, right? Like paying attention to something is shumat lev, like sim lev, pay attention. So put your heart on it. It doesn't mean fall in love with it. It means you now are focusing your attention on something and that means that your heart is involved. So if you're supposed to love Hashem b'chol levavcha, then b'chol levavcha, all of your heart, sounds perhaps like loving Hashem should be somehow part of the reason you're doing everything that you're doing, right? Everything that you consciously do on purpose is something that your heart is directing, so to speak, in the Lashon of the Torah. And if that's the case, then perhaps it is reasonable to say, look, if you're going to do this right, then every single thing you do, you should be able to answer the question, how is this helping me to serve Hashem better? Right? I'm an Oved Hashem. I'm not going to subdivide my life. I mean, and some people, maybe advocate for an alternative position that you could kind of caricature and can be problematic, where they might say, look, the Torah sets boundaries. It obligates me to certain activities I have to do. It sets boundaries for me saying I can't do certain things. And now I have this constrained but still very big space of things that I'm allowed to do. And then within that space, it's just like I paint whatever I want on that blank canvas. And I've checked all the boxes, and now I'm, correctly accomplishing my service of Hashem and doing positive mitzvot and avoiding transgressing negative mitzvot. But then beyond that, if right now I want a hamburger and there's nothing standing in the way of that, as far as it's not forbidden, and it's not going to prevent me from doing some other positive mitzvah that I, needed to make time for or whatever, then I just go and do that. And it's between me and the hamburger, so to speak. Now, it's a bit of a caricature, but I think there are some people who maybe want to approach keeping the Torah this way. And I don't want to suggest that they're entirely wrong to do that, because at one level, that is a fair description of how this works, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to give us herut, freedom, right? And the herut, the freedom of Yitziat Mitzrayim, of getting out of Egypt and going to serve Hashem instead of serving Paro, is about keeping his laws. And then those create a sort of skeleton or framework within which we are free to serve him the way that we are inclined. And there is some truth to that. So from one standpoint, you could say, okay, that's a fair way of characterizing it. But clearly the way I put it sounds a little bit too extreme or too problematic, because the idea that you should be able to say, okay, I, so to speak, paid at the office, or I checked all of my boxes. I can tell, this is the whole space of what's kasher, what is permitted to me. I'm staying within these boundaries. And I've dealt with all of my positive obligations for the moment. So I'm not sort of avoiding somehow fulfilling the commandment that I have from Hashem. And then what's left to me is now, it's my time off. It's me time, so to speak. And now whatever I want to do, I within those boundaries, it's between me and myself and no one else to decide, what is right, because I have avoided transgressing or avoided ignoring the command of Hashem. There's something from the standpoint of Kriyat Shema that's problematic about that, right? Because Kriyat Shema is saying, B'chol levavcha, like with all of your heart, meaning that even when you're on your free time, so to speak, you shouldn't be asking yourself, okay, now that I've, made sure I'm right by all the boundaries, what do I feel like doing? And that's, just for me to decide. There's still the possibility of seeking relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and what you do next. And seemingly, we are being not just kind of nudged, but maybe even commanded to regard that kind of a moment as another opportunity to show love of Hashem and Kriyat Shema. And there's one maybe kind of resolution of this that comes from a midrashic comment, homiletic comment by the sages on Bechol Levavcha. We said again, you should love your Hashem with all your hearts, not heart, not Bechol Libecha, but Bechol Levavcha. And so Chazal say that means Im Shnei Yitzrecha, with your two inclinations, meaning you have a Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, you have an inclination to do good and an inclination to do bad, and you should somehow use both of them to serve Hashem. Meaning, you could read it different ways, but like, let's say there are things that I like doing that are technically permitted, but maybe are not like my best character traits. Like I like to get up in front of people and have their attention or something like that. Suppose that were true. Well, one way of getting people's attention is by teaching Torah to a bunch of people, right? Another way of getting people's attention is to do something that has nothing to do with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nothing to do with serving Hashem, and you just are in the free space of whatever you're inclined to do. And the point is that maybe what Chazal are saying is like, to the extent possible, take the thing that might have led you to do something that was more sort of self-focused and self-indulgent, and find a way of elevating it, turning it into a way of serving Hashem. So that's one way of maybe resolving this. But I think it doesn't quite deal with a bigger question here that maybe more specifically links up with the Mishkan. So we have on the one hand already this idea that there's kind of a contradiction where maybe to some degree the Torah is trying to give us freedom to choose what to do, and leave us with a lot of kind of unfixed requirements that we get to determine ourselves. And maybe on the other hand, the Torah is saying every choice you make should somehow be about your relationship with Hashem. And we can envision, I think, extremes of both kinds, one of which is saying, like, at the moment, I'm pushing HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of the picture. I've, done my duty for the moment, and I'm going to just focus now on myself. That sounds problematic. And on the other hand, it also sounds problematic to say every single instant of every choice that you make should still somehow come to you as a kind of fulfillment of the divine command, because then it doesn't sound like you have much freedom. And it also is very puzzling how to know what to do, because the Torah doesn't submit itself as a system that answers every question about what you should do before you do it. It leaves a lot open. And if you are asking the question, okay, in the next second, in the next minute, in the next hour, how am I going to serve Hashem, given that at the moment I feel a bit free? Are you supposed to bake a cake? Are you supposed to go for a walk? Which of those things, if there's nothing kind of imposing requirements on you, somehow serves Hashem better? How are you supposed to even reason that out? It seems kind of a contradiction in terms. So that's one kind of contradiction, one kind of question we want to ask. And I also think with respect to the Mishkan, before we start answering things a little bit, with respect to the Mishkan, there's another kind of question you can ask, which is thinking more specifically about the idea of melacha, about crafts, right? That the Mishkan or the Mikdash, the tabernacle or the temple are built from all of these crafts. You're weaving, you're dyeing fabric, you're shaping metal, et cetera, et cetera. And that's work, right? And that's work you might be doing in a context that has nothing to do with building the Mikdash, right? People need all sorts of metalworked items, and people need all sorts of fabrics. And being good at those things might allow you to make your living doing them, even if you weren't dedicating the product of your labor to the temple. And the question that this moment where Moshe says, stop, you're doing too much, don't do this also for the temple, what it raises is, so if a person is capable of doing a certain amount of work and creating things and building things, clearly, in the narrow sense, when you're building the Mishkan, there's only supposed to be one menorah, so you make the menorah, and you don't say, let's make two because we have two people who can make menorot or whatever, the lamp. Um, so you're just should be following the instructions. That was the first point we made. But it raises this question of how should any person who's working in their job and creating things regard him or herself, as far as, is it appropriate? How much of that effort is really going to what they would call serving Hashem? Whether it's building the temple, which has a clear upper limit on it, because again, you're not going to make two menorahs or whatever, or more generally, serving Hashem, where you say, okay, I'm doing some kind of work and I'm going to make widgets and sell them. And partly I have to support my family, and partly I enjoy doing the work, et cetera. And like all these different reasons are convening, are converging on the situation to motivate you to do something. But if a person is doing work that isn't to build the Mishkan, or doesn't have connection to the temple, doesn't have connection to serving Hashem, do we just say, oh, that's fine. That's normal life. That's the way the world is supposed to work. Most of what people are doing is not for that purpose. Or do we start to ask the skeptical question, like, well, but could you be doing more to serve Hashem? If at the moment you're making this pile of widgets because you want to sell it, because you want to get the money that you receive from that and use it to purchase like tastier food than you're used to, or something like that. Is it always the case that everything that you're doing, you're trying to trace back to serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu in some way? And if you haven't justified some choice you've made in those terms, then somehow you're a failure and you're not serving Hashem enough. There's something a little bit paradoxical about that, because really, if everyone is just trying to, so to speak, be a laborer building the Mishkan, they're trying to sort of dedicate all of their efforts to something that they regard as like, I'm doing this because I'm serving Hashem, then there's a whole lot of life and society in the world that we've kind of pushed to the margins, maybe, and even basic questions about like our responsibilities to each other, where you say, "V'ahavta l'reach kamocha," you should love your fellow as yourself. And so, if my neighbor, has a car and I love my car, then I'm not going to scratch my neighbor's car because I love my car and I wouldn't want that to happen to me. And could someone just come in there and say, well, but really both of you shouldn't have a car, or both of you shouldn't care about your car. You should just care about serving Hashem. And why do you need a nicer car? Maybe you can do with a car that's not so nice. All these kind of ways in which someone could come in and, on the one hand, say, well, you have a mitzvah to be concerned for the desires of other people. And part of keeping the Torah is somehow all the different torts and all the different sort of legal cases that we study or whatever, where there are self-interested parties who are in some kind of tension with each other over, my field and your ox or whatever else. And it's a lot about private property and all these things. And then at the same time, someone could come in and say, well, but why do you even want this property? Like, give the ox to the temple, or, why are you even doing this thing, this widget making that you're doing? You could make fewer widgets and you could eat food that's less good, and then you could make more things that you could somehow donate to making the service of Hashem greater, or what have you. And that, I think, it's a question we probably are supposed to be asking ourselves at some level, right? We should be asking, whom am I working for right now, right? Like, am I Yosef? Am I working for Paro, so to speak? Am I serving some kind of earthly, material objective? And I have, to some degree, kind of cut HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of the picture, and I don't really understand why what I'm doing serves Hashem, but I just kind of want to win, or I want to get what I'm going to get out of the work that I'm doing. Or if we ask ourselves that question, should we be responding and saying, the world wouldn't go round if everyone were so obsessed with the narrow definition of what Avodat Hashem means, and they said, okay, I just care about bringing sheep to the temple, or I want to, weave dyed fabric in order to make more stuff for the Mishkan, then Moshe is going to come and say, look, there's more than enough of that already. Go do something else. So how do we resolve these contradictions? What are we supposed to be doing with ourselves in the end? And is it all for Hashem, or is part of it for us once we've done our part, and that's the freedom we have, and that's our reward? How do you resolve those two perspectives? So um, I, I I suppose there must be many things that you could say on this subject. Briefly, what I would like to offer, which I think may be suitable for every kind of paradox or question that we've raised so far, is to say that the answer may lie in the fact that there are things that the Torah tells us about how to serve Hashem that we tend to just kind of glide by, but that may actually be telling us kind of meta framework level ways of deciding how we should be living our life in general, that give us that kind of guidance when we're painting in the free space and what's permitted to us, and that we have resources to dedicate ourselves to. And what I would point to there are various psukim that you see. One of them is a famous phrase, "V'Hai that you should live according to the Torah. Another one is "Uvaharta b'Hayim," that you should choose life. And I will mention another verse from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, in a moment that I think connects with this. But the fundamental notion of you should choose life, or you should live according to the Torah, we tend to focus on, as perhaps we should, the narrow aspect, which is that we're not meant to choose to die for the Torah. There, in oral law, this is more complicated with respect to a few issues like idolatry and adultery, etc. But if you're leaving a select small number of cases aside, murder as well, then you're not meant to die in order to keep the Torah. And to the degree that that's the case, there are a lot of things you can do, like violating Shabbat, in order to live, so that you can keep many more Shabbatot, right? That there's this notion of life is paramount. But I think we're so impressed by that aspect of it that we don't ask whether there's more meaning there in v'hai or v'harta b'Hayim. You should choose life, or you will choose life. You live according to the Torah. The question is, what does it mean to live, right? Is living just not being dead? Is living just having, your heart pumping, so to speak? Or should we ask more deeply, what is a living thing? What binds living things together? What do they have in common? And I think that you could argue that there are things that living things have in common that might be informative here. Like, for example, living things have desires, right? Living things have inclinations. They have hungers. They have wants. And there's something, there's a pietistic strain that, always runs through the idea of submitting to the will of your creator, where it might sound like my desires are things that I should be trying to kind of give up to some degree, right? Because they're going to tempt me into doing the wrong thing a lot of the time. And if I just desired fewer things, then I wouldn't, be as tempted to commit certain sins. And so, like, you start to be able to make the argument to yourself that talking about, your desires, like there are things that you legitimately want, you can easily kind of spiral down into this pietistic state of self-annihilation, where you say, no, if I'm really serving Hashem bechol levavcha, so to speak, with all of your heart or hearts, then I should be removing from the picture what I want, so that I can just figure out what Hashem wants and then dedicate myself to doing that. Now, we already talked about bechol levavcha, meaning im shnei yitzracha, that Chazal are saying, no, you have inclinations, serve Hashem with those inclinations. So in a sense, we already are seeing the answer here, but I think that it comes more clearly when we think about, again, the nature of a living thing. Living things, a large part of what living things do is they follow the hungers or cravings or desires that they have and act on them. And if you're an animal, that's all you do. And it obviously leads to all sorts of behavior that we wouldn't do or shouldn't do as people, especially as Ovdei Hashem. But to the degree that we have that in common with animals, it may partly be the case that you could argue that the Torah is telling us it's not just that you have this free space that is bounded by Torah, but once you're in that free space, you decide what to do. It may be as well that Hashem is saying, look, I created you and I created you with your inclinations and your desires. And uvacharta v'chaim or v'chai b'chem, right, that you should live according to my Torah. Part of what that means is that it's not just permitted for you to be motivated by what you like to do. It may actually be part of properly serving Hashem, that you try to think about, like, what do I desire that is permitted to me? And let that not just be a decision that you're making that, so to speak, shuts Hashem out, but rather that we are asking the question, okay, if this is permitted to me, and it's not interfering with my serving Hashem in all these explicit ways that are commanded, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu made me, and he made me with the heart that I have, and I have various inclinations. How do I make the best combination of following those inclinations that will allow me to serve him best? And it's both the case, perhaps, that I can use those inclinations to serve Hashem better if I am thoughtful about it. That's this idea of Im Shnei Yitzrecha. And it's also the case that the enjoyment that I get from following those inclinations may be part of my reward, my zchut, my merit, for serving Hashem properly, right? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to enjoy serving him. There actually is a pasuk in the Torah when all these curses are actually being given about, what if you choose not to follow Hashem and you serve other gods in Sefer Dvarim? And there's a point at which the Torah is saying that you're going to be punished, and you're going to have all this horrible stuff that happens to you. And it says that is because you didn't serve Hashem with joy and with a good heart, right? So, Tahat asher lo va'adata et Adonai Elohecha b'simcha uvetuv levav merov kol. So because you serve not the Lord your God with joyfulness and with gladness of the heart, the abundance of all things. Notice that word again, levav, as opposed to betuv lev. But the point is that it's saying HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you not just to do what you're instructed, but he wants you to find a way of serving him joyfully and with a goodly heart, with the desire to do it. Partly because you're trying to work on yourself and desire what Hashem wants, but not to the point of self-annihilation, right? This isn't about the extirpation of the self and the subsumption of the self into some kind of like greater good. Like that's for other ideologies. That's not for the Torah. Clearly, what Hashem probably wants is for us to seek life. And by doing so, he wants us to seek that which we desire and find ways within the bounds of Torah of connecting what we desire to our actions and to what we think would serve him best. And I mentioned before that I think that Sefer Kohelet maybe makes this point as well. There's a point, and Kohelet is very complicated because it's King Solomon, but he's very wise, and he's written what some have argued is actually a contest amongst different perspectives. There's a wonderful series of shiurim I've been listening to by Rav Moshe Shulman about this, like you have different voices in Kohelet, and they're all Shlomo, but they're kind of arguing with each other. Like, is life just about enjoyment? Is it about serving God, etc.? So I don't think you can say it's fully the case that, if we have this one pasuk somewhere in Kohelet that says something that just sums everything up. But one of the things when Kohelet is talking about, you should live life, to your fullest, so to speak, and try to enjoy it, is aseh haim imisha sharafta, that you should, aseh haim is to make life or to enjoy yourself with a woman that you love. And interestingly, Hazal have a comment on that pasuk where they say, well, that means you should actually have a profession that you like. Which is funny. It's sort of obvious that actually the simple reading also makes sense for the same reason, that if you don't like what you do, you're not going to do it as well. Also, if don't try to find any kind of love, in your relationship, where you're married, you're, trying to make it work, with a family or what have you, it's going to be harder if people don't have a desire for each other. And that doesn't mean it's impossible, and it's a complicated discussion, in its own right. But the point is that what Shlomo is saying in Kohelet is from a standpoint of wisdom, just makes sense that you should both perhaps try to find in life the opportunity to not just be with a woman, but be with a woman that you love. And also maybe, with adding the comment of Chazal, that with your profession, there's something similar there where, yes, it's true that you can make a job work even if you hate it, but if it's a lot of what you spend your time doing, you'll do it better, and maybe you will, therefore, as a result, be more productive and, have more that you can give to other things if you find some kind of work to do that you actually enjoy doing. And so in the end, coming back to the Mishkan, I think the point is that there is something, um, on the one hand, problematic about saying, well, the Mishkan is only a limited amount of activity, and then what you're supposed to do is just whatever else you want to do in that blank space, and it doesn't connect you to Hashem at all. That would be too extreme in the one direction. And in the other direction, to say, well, ideally, everyone would just be focused on things that were about bringing sheep to the temple or growing crops that could then be brought, to Jerusalem, et cetera, et cetera. That, like, if you can't, if your job somehow is too many steps removed from mitzvot that are written black on white in the Torah, then you must have failed. There's plenty of different things that people can do that they enjoy doing, that's permitted to them, and that if they think about it, they can still say, okay, why am I going to go and eat a meal right now or make it tasty for myself? Or why am I going to go and do this part of my job that is not going to produce anything that I'm going to, directly dedicate to the actual functioning of the temple? Is there a way that you can, in making those somewhat mundane choices sometimes in life, still say, okay, but how do I involve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and my relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in those choices, but not in a way where, since he's in the room, so to speak, that means I have to annihilate myself and my desires and just bring it all back to, well, what is he telling me to do? I'll do that, and that will be my satisfaction. There is room for saying, well, he may not be telling you to do everything that you're going to do, and some of what you're going to do might be driven by desires that you have, but he gave you those desires. And if fulfilling those desires is permissible to you according to the Torah, then there may be ways of actually seeking that fulfillment that are part of what he wants from you in the particular service that you're going to do for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And one last point I would just add is that I think to modify or make slightly more complicated what I just said, it also needs to be mentioned that with all of that being said, we live in a society that is hyper specialized, has all of this division of labor and all of this specialization. And there's an enormous number of jobs that people have where, they might enjoy them, and also they need to make a living. And what they're actually doing, to some degree, might be called a little bit alienating or disconnecting, right? In a highly developed capitalist society, you have people where their job might be that they are a human resources officer in a company that produces software that they try to sell to other companies that helps those people collaborate and be more productive, right? So the number of steps removed you are from doing things that aren't just talking to people or helping to persuade people to act together in certain ways, but have more to do with, like, I grew this potato and I pulled it out of the ground, or I herded this sheep and now we're going to slaughter it, or what have you. You might be a great many steps away from some of those very tangible outcomes. And that doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to be doing, but it is interesting that, when Marxists, especially in the 20th century, in the sort of like Frankfurt School, approach to try to attack capitalism, where there's this focus on, all of this alienation that the capitalist process produces, and that there's all of this very rich layer of activities people are engaged in where the value of what they're doing is determined by a sort of ideological system that they are participating in, and they don't see the direct value, for the most part, of a plow that works or what have you, and they're operating in this realm of what I do involves coordinating other people in certain ways, and I'm told that it's valuable, but actually there's this whole system that has been put in place to assign value to things, and you can start kind of making your head spin thinking about it. And obviously Marxists, they got very good in the 20th century at saying, well, doesn't that seem a little bit alienating? And wouldn't you like to consider what's behind door number two? And it turned out what was behind door number two invariably was mass murder and mass oppression, and nothing that it actually made sense to choose in favor of what the Marxists were critiquing. But the reason, perhaps, or one of the reasons that they got some traction is because they did point out some things that were a little bit demoralizing about the capitalist system, where people feel like they're a cog in the machine, or they don't see the direct value of what they're creating and experience it. And with all of that being said, I think it does have to be acknowledged that the actual temple, the actual Mikdash, the actual Mishkan, are things that root not just a few people, but really the whole society in participation in an economy that needs to support the creation of a lot of very tangible things that have very appealing and obvious value, right? Like fabrics that you could wear, or colors that are beautiful, or metalwork that makes vessels that can be used, etc. That it's not the case that Moshe wants everyone doing that all the time, because if that were true, then they would obviously produce much more than is needed for the temple. But what is true is that if you're going to make a temple and operate it, you do need people who are involved in agriculture, and you need people who are involved in animal husbandry, and you need people who are involved in weaving and dyeing fabric and all the rest. And it may be that you need an economy of people who do that for various reasons because they enjoy it. That's much bigger than the part that actually has to produce what you need for the temple in order to maintain expertise and in order to create the demand for the skill that then has to be applied in this particular context. And so, while we started by saying it's not the case that everyone should just be working on building and operating the temple all the time, I think it's nonetheless also the case that the Torah does envision a sense in which the opportunity to serve Hashem with this particular set of material activities in the physical world, involving the Mikdash and all of its operations, etc., everything to do with the land and agriculture, and everything to do with food, and everything to do with music and aesthetic, visual beauty and everything else, that when you're doing that, you are creating a kind of beacon of anti-alienation that emanates throughout the entire society and gives everyone a chance to kind of come and participate to some degree, and sort of sit on the edge of what's happening and make sure that part of the role that they're playing in the society that they've chosen for themselves, that they love and that they want to partly understand how to dedicate to service of Hashem, that set of activities has more of an opportunity to stay rooted in some practical, material, tangible things that help, as it turns out, help people to feel like they know what it is in this world that they're creating and what gives it meaning, and they can reach out and touch it and feel a greater sense of fulfillment about that.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.